Say, did you know the fear of change is worse than the change itself? How does that apply to you? Well, we'll talk about that on today's PivotPreneur episode. Let's pivot.
Here we go. Pivot. Pivot. Pivot.
Well, hello, everybody. I am Todd Stalker, your PivotPreneur host and coach. This podcast, and for those of you watching on our YouTube channel, is dedicated to answering your questions about life, about leadership, and the pursuit of change. Now, just as a kind of a quick background, I wasn't planning to share this, but this is I've done a couple of podcasts in the past, and this one by far has been the one that has really resonated with people because all of us have life questions, life challenges. We want to be better leaders. We want to be able to pursue change when things aren't working out. But a lot of us kind of feel stuck when we have to make those changes. That's why the tagline "Pursuit of Change" is really important, because sometimes in your life, a lot of times in your life, instead of change just letting it happen to you, oftentimes you have to actually pursue that change. So that's really what we talk about here. Every fifth episode, we do an interview with somebody who has actually pursued change. Next week, make sure you're listening. That would be episode 30, I believe. I'm interviewing Marnie Kobnek, who's a friend of mine. She moved from Wisconsin all the way down to Roatan, Honduras. Yep, she's an expat. And she talks about that process and what her life was like and what it is now, and some of those issues around that change. So she pursued change and has never looked back. So that's next week, episode 30. But just real quick, this episode is actually going to be a little bit shorter than normal because there's been a consistent theme that I've been talking about as I'm answering questions and having conversations throughout the week about change and actually this uncertainty and the fear of change. And so I want to just talk a little bit about that specific topic, fear of change. Before we get into that, we do take questions on this podcast. For those of you on our YouTube, you can actually just ask a question in the notes underneath this video, or you can send them into pivotpreneur.com or toddstalker.com, either one. And you might be asked to, or I might use your question on a future episode. Make sure you like the podcast and the YouTube channel, but the podcast also on Apple. Share these episodes around wherever your social media world revolves around. More people get that you share to, the more people get to hear this, and we build a bigger group and community and family of pivotpreneurs. One other thing I'm pretty excited about. Today is Friday, so 2 weeks from today, I'm going to be speaking in Phoenix at a very popular conference for my section of the work world called the Best Practices for Ministry. And my session is actually on best leadership through coaching. And I'm not talking about football coach or coaching a team. Well, you are coaching a team, but I'm talking about everybody, I believe, needs to have a basic skill of being a coach as they approach their leadership. Often, and this is a little plug for my session, but I might do some podcasts and even maybe I'm developing a course on this. But every person needs to have a basic coach approach to leadership, or even just interacting with their family or friends or people at work. Because too often, if you're a leader, you know this, people come to your door, they dump a whole bunch of problems on you, and they expect you to have all the answers and for you to solve it. And if you're busy and you just want to, and you know the answer, you just want to spurt off the answer and tell them what to do. Not a great way to lead. That's being a boss, not a leader. So that session at Best Practices for Ministry in 2 weeks from today, I'm really excited about that, and I'll make that available for those of you on my podcast and the YouTube channel. You can hear it and see it as well. So this whole thing of fear of change, there's a quote by Anonymous. This anonymous person writes a lot of quotes, I'm finding. But the quote of the day is this: "The fear of change is like staring into a cloud through which you cannot see. Yet, through the mist lies a beautiful horizon the mind cannot fathom." I really like that, because if you think about a cloudy day, the sun is still shining. It just, there's clouds in the way of you seeing the other side of it. So that's really at the essence and heart of how to deal with and work through overcoming that fear of change. Because honestly, and this, change can be a scary thing. Somebody once said, the only one who likes change is a wet baby. I've said that often because change, it makes us feel vulnerable. There's uncertainty in that change, and it can be hard for us to let go of what we're used to and embrace something new. But change can also be a great opportunity for growth and progress if you do it correctly, or if you have just a background skill of how do you respond to what is happening around you, and whether you're pursuing that change and making that happen, or whether the change is just sort of happening to you. We're still in a weird work situation. We went from the Great Resignation to now this whole situation of people not being able to find people to hire, and we're just sort of in this influx. 70 to 80% of people, maybe that's you watching on YouTube or on the podcast, you're thinking about or wanting to make a change in your job. And frankly, this is a great time to do it for many reasons. My course, 5 Steps to Work You Love, actually tells you why now is a great time to make a change if you're going to do it. But it is scary to embrace something new, but it does open up the other side of the cloud where there's great opportunity for growth and for progress. So in this podcast, in this episode, we're going to discuss some strategies. I always fumble on that word. I don't know why. We'll discuss strategies for overcoming the fear of change and embracing it as an opportunity for growth. We'll discuss how to identify what's holding you back, how to practice self-care, which is really important, and how to set yourself up for success when facing a new challenge. Okay? So let's dive in. Here's the first one. Let's talk about how to identify what's causing the fear of change. Well, again, fear of the unknown is one of the biggest factors when it comes to change. And it's important to take the time to recognize what is causing that fear. Maybe it's something from your past. There's an element of changing a job where maybe your parents or your dad or your mom changed a job when you were young and it devastated you financially, and things were really rough for a couple of years. Maybe that's kind of a movie soundtrack or a movie track in the back of your head as you're thinking about making the same kind of change. Or maybe it's changing in a relationship or a personal health habit. You've had some failure in the past that's been hurtful, and so you're afraid. Maybe it's something like that. Or maybe is it that sense of lack of control? Is it insecurity? Is it lack of confidence? Is it one of those things? Really take time to identify what is behind those feelings of fear, because fear is just a feeling. The feelings of fear that you have when you think about making a change. Okay, once you identify really what's causing your fear, you could start to work on those issues and move forward by just taking small steps. Reality is one of the best ways to expunge fear. I like that word. To sponge out, to weed out fear in your life. You just take a step forward, take a step in action toward some of the change you want to do, and a lot of that fear disappears every step that you take. Okay, so that's the first one. Secondly, what's important when you're looking at a change and dealing with the fear that could and uncertainty that could happen is practice self-care when it comes to facing change. Now, self-care it's essential when it comes to facing a big challenge like change. And self-care is really simply being in tune to and taking time. That's really the big one, really. But taking time to make sure that you're okay, that you're healthy to the best of your ability, whether that's physically, emotionally, spiritually, relationally, whatever that is. Make sure that as you're stepping through change and coming up against those fear factors or those fear feelings, that you're constantly in tune to, how am I doing? Am I losing sleep over this? How can I change that? Okay. Take the time to rest, to relax, practice mindfulness, And what I would include in all of that is get a coach. I'm a professional coach, so you can hire me to walk you through change. I've had people do that multiple times. You could get a friend to walk alongside you. Just make sure you're not doing these changes alone. Okay. Once you identify what's causing your fear, you can kind of start to work on issues. The self-care and mindfulness will help you stay grounded and focused on what you need to do next. Finally, let's talk about how to set yourself up for success when it comes to change. Well, one of the things, there's kind of I don't know if it's called a balancing act between goal setting and having those the BHAGs, remember from Jim Collins' book from many years ago, big, hairy, audacious goals, and we work toward those, okay? And having realistic goals and expectations. I think you need to balance both. So whatever change you're thinking about doing, maybe even if it's moving across town or moving out of state, you have to hold kind of those the big, hairy, audacious goals and the realistic steps and expectations and goals kind of in a tension. And that's hard to do because you want to push yourself farther. But if your goals are so far ahead and you don't reach those goals, unless you know how to handle that, ultimately it can lead to some depression and even more fear gets piled on. So don't be too hard on yourself if you don't see immediate results in what you're doing, in those little changes, in those little steps. Change takes time. It just does. And it's important to be really patient with yourself. Okay, so that's the essence of what I want to talk about, those three things, just kind of identifying that fear, those feelings of fear, I'm not sure I should be doing this, even though your mind is saying, yep, this makes sense, this is what I should be doing. So identify that fear, make sure that you're being as healthy as you can as you're making some of these changes. Again, for some of you on YouTube or on the podcast, the changes you're thinking about making are kind of minor. Like in my office, we just painted my office and it's now kind of a silvery white color, and we went from a dark tan color. And so those are little minor changes, and my self-care was staying out of this room because it stunk. But again, that's a little light on the subject, but make sure that self-care is part of and being more in tune to taking time away for rest and relaxation as you're making those changes. And then again, set yourself up for success with big, hairy, audacious goals, but also goals and steps toward the change that you can actually manage and handle. Somebody once said, "Oh, you have to be able to own the goal. You can't control if people respond to your marketing, but you can control how much marketing you send out." That's the one I like to think about. I can't force people to come to my business, but I can force myself, or I can control how present and how much marketing and advertising that I can do for my real estate business, coaching, and everything else that I'm doing. Okay. Whew, I know that was a little bit quick, a lot and a little, but I hope that has been helpful for you. Change is a big deal, and we're faced with it, whether we pursue that change in our leadership, in our life, or whether it's kind of thrust upon us. There are things that we can do and should be able to do so that we can not just survive change, but thrive through it. So again, I hope that's helpful. You're why I do this podcast every week, as I say that every week, because my personal mission statement is to honor God by adding value and leadership to people around me. And so hopefully that's what I'm doing with this podcast. I'd love to hear from you. Go ahead and go to toddstocker.com or PivotPreneur.com. Send me a note. If you're on YouTube, just drop a comment if you liked this video or liked this episode. And then I really want to talk about topics that you want to talk about. So ask a question, make a point about your life or a pivot that you want, and I'll use that on the show. So thanks again. Remember, if you develop and discover and deploy your purpose, you too can be a pivotpreneur, find work you love, and conquer this thing called life, leadership, and the pursuit of change. Make it a great day.